Partiamo. Okay, excellent, great. Well, after all kinds of technical and physical movements, I think we're ready to start. It's going to take me a while to get used to this, but I'll do my best, and I thank you very much for bearing with me. I apologize for not speaking Italian, but I think I'll probably do a better job in English. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for being here, those of you who are with us in the room, and if there's anyone online as well, including my fellow speakers. Thank you for the organizers of this event for inviting me and my fellow panelists today. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's an honor for me to chair this panel. And I will admit that I have a kind of a selfish reason for being here. Because the organization that I represent is going through precisely this kind of huge transformation, expansion, and change that I hope that we will be talking about today. So I'm really hoping to learn a lot today from all of you. And take away some learnings and some tips. My name is Evgeny Arafsov. I come from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And what's happening with us at the moment is we are, as I said, expanding and growing nationally and internationally. Internationally in East Asia, in China, and further afield. Nationally in Scotland, we opened a museum in Dundee 2 years ago. Regionally, also elsewhere in England, we've just absorbed into our family V&A Wedgwood. It's a famous porcelain collection that you might have heard of. So that's in Staffordshire in England. And we're also growing within London. We're opening 2 new sites in East London and the site of the former Olympic Park within the next 5 years. But the V&A really is not unique in what's happening to it. If anything, we're probably late to the party, because over the past 20 years, there's been a huge expansion and a huge boom. All right, I think we lost me. Nothing? Yeah? No? No? Okay, probably not. All right, so what I was saying is over the past 20 years, there's been a huge boom and a growth in museums, expansion all over the world, a huge appetite, a huge growth in audiences, a huge consumer boom internationally and nationally for museums, particularly in the areas that have not only the appetite, but the buying power to match. And this has fueled a growth in an expansion in big museum brands. I'm sure you all know the Pompidou. We have a guest on the panel today, Chiara, Parisi from the Pompidou Metz. So they've opened a branch in France, in Metz, in Shanghai. There's one coming up soon in the suburb of Paris, Massy. And then recently announced in Jersey in the US. The Louvre in Abu Dhabi, just down the road from where another one of our speakers is. The Tate has got a network of museums around the UK. They've also recently opened in China. In China itself, the UCCA is expanding exponentially across the country. But also alongside that, there are regional museums and new cultural attractions opening in smaller cities all around the world. These institutions, they've been credited with the ability to transform the fortunes of a city, contribute to socioeconomic growth, and possess the ability to enhance the importance of a city and empower its citizens and visitors. But another thing is happening, another phenomenon is happening, is that museums themselves are starting to behave in a really interesting way, not unlike commercial organizations. For example, in West Sydney, in Parramatta, the Powerhouse Museum of Arts and Applied Sciences are abandoning almost their site in central Sydney and moving to a suburban area where there are more, that's more densely populated. That's really unusual. So I'm hoping today to kind of unpack some of these phenomena of the shifting museum landscape between expansion and locality, kind of maybe take stock of the development so far, and to talk about challenges that these organizations are facing today, and what the future might hold for these organizations and their audiences. So I'll stop there, and maybe I'll move to introducing my panel, which is distributed across this room and also online. I will start with those who are online with us, hopefully. Chiara Parisi has been the director of Pompidou Metz since December 2019. She's an Italian art historian and curator. She has worked in Rome before. She was a curator of exhibitions at the French Academy in the Villa Medici. But right before that, she was in France at the Monet de Paris, where she curated some trailblazing exhibitions of contemporary art. Some of my other speakers is Sheikha Nawar bin Ahmed Al-Qassimi, who's the director of Sharjah Art Foundation. It's a long-standing art powerhouse in the Gulf and the MENA regions that functions as an advocate and a catalyst and a producer for contemporary art in the Gulf and the wider region. They run the famous Sharjah Biennale since 1993, grants, residencies, exhibitions, commissions, etc., etc. In the room with me are Emanuela Daffra, who heads up the Regional Directorate of Musei Lombardia. She has a formidable experience as an art historian and a museum professional, having worked in some of Italy's leading institutions, such as the Opificio Prorettore in Firenze, Accademia Carrara di Bergamo, and Pinacoteca di Brera in Milano. I think our translation has stopped, but I will go on nevertheless, I guess. It always happens when he leaves. Sophie Languillaume on my left is the former commercial director at La Cité as of October. She's running her own company, although I can't imagine why you would leave a job where wine presumably is on tap, but there you are. So when she was at La Cité du Vin in Bordeaux, she was responsible for commercial operations, the shop, visitor operations. The Cité du Vin was established sort of in response to UNESCO's entering French wine and gourmet culture into the list of intangible heritage. And Signor Umberto Croppi on my right is a cultural management and communication professional, director of Federculture, which is an agency that works to support museums in their work and their connection with the private sector. I think I've got it right, more or less. But he has also run a number of publishing houses and art galleries in Italy, and also teaches at Università Roma Tre and here at La Sapienza sometimes. Yes. Don't know. Did she give up on me? Yes. Well, and finally, Professor Paolo Carafa, unfortunately. There he is. Who is a professor of archaeology and the prorector of the archeological Patrimonio at the Sapienza. His research interests include history of art and archaeology of ancient Greece and Rome. He conducts research and archaeological digs in excavations around Rome and surrounding areas, as well as a server of a number of scientific committees within the Ministry of Culture and the World Bank as well. Professor Carafa is the author of 7 monographs and over 70 publications. Oh. All right, well, I've gone on for long enough. I wanted to give the word to my panelists, and in the preparation for this talk, I've looked at the title of this panel. It was given to me in Italian, so I translated it into English, and I sort of focused on the word delocalizzazione, relocating, or even offshoring. And some of the things that jumped out on at me when I was looking at that is sort of transferring your operations elsewhere, offshore, away from the center, if you like, to achieve a competitive advantage. So the competitive advantage is what I wanted to focus on and what I asked my panelists to respond to. So from your point of view, where you are, for your organizations, what is the competitive advantage of working where you are and the way you are working? How would you define that? So perhaps we'll start with Emanuela, if that's all right.
All right. So we have 12 museums. In the past, it was less than 12 museums. And as I said, 12 museums that I'm going to list very quickly to you. And well, now I'm going to reply to your question. So in terms of advantages, we have the Cenacolo by Leonardo in Milan, the Museum of Certosa, Pavia, and the Archaeological Museum in Vigevano. So these are two, and also two beautiful sites in Sirmione, the caves of Catullo, the excavations of the Roman villa in Desenzano, and then Val Camonica, and then the National Archaeological Museum of Valle Camonica Romana. And also there's another museum in Valtellina, and then there's another one, the Royal Chapel in Monza. This is the monument where the King Umberto I was killed. So as you can see, we have many fragmented museums, many fragmented sites. And so we have problems related to marginalization. I mean, it's very hard, very difficult to reach some of these places starting from Milan. So there are some clear disadvantages for this situation. But there's also an advantage, that is to say, this, well, you know, this is a very strong advantage, very clear advantage, especially considering that we want to keep on growing. Considering that nowadays, due to the pandemic, the current situation has changed completely, so we can now make some new tests on some small museums. Finally, we can test the requests that are made to museums. That is to say, museums want to be in close connection with the community. We want to be drivers for social economic growth, and also we would like to carry out some projects that are really tailor-made projects for our communities.
Hello, hi everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, hi everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here with you and to speak. I wish I was in the room with everybody, but unfortunately I'm quite far away. Just touching upon some of the topics that we were discussing earlier that Evgenia mentioned, talking about what I like to think of as decentralizing our locations, which is something that we do in Sharjah. And kind of moving away to different areas, whether it's by having branches or spaces or different venues to work from. In Sharjah, we are located mainly in the heart of the old city. We run the Sharjah Biennial, which takes place every 2 years and takes over the entire emirate of Sharjah and not just the city. So we are branching out of the core of the city to different landscapes, different towns, different audiences and different spaces. We work in heritage sites and in contemporary galleries, as well as different venues that are an hour or so away from the center of the city, that are in the desert, by the mountains, across different sites on the Indian Ocean, etc. So we don't have specifically central locations. And by working in various spaces that we are branching out to, it means that we have to think about different audiences and different types of programming, because of course you're not in the center of the big city. Some of our venues are in smaller towns, in a fishing village, in the desert, around farmland. However, moving out of the center, decentralizing and moving to these different spaces gives us the opportunity to create new audiences. It also gives artists the space to create. So when we are confined to smaller spaces or galleries or heritage houses, for example, there's a lot that you cannot do. There are so many restrictions. But when we are out in public spaces, when we are out in buildings that are in a different landscape, there's so much more to experience for the artist and for the audience. It's also important for us to think about what is surrounding us. So when artists are working in historic locations and historic sites, or beside conservations or natural reserves, or in different environmentally rich areas, it means that we can create different works. And because we are a government-run foundation, our kind of mandate is to work within the Emirate of Sharjah, not just the city, but the Emirate of Sharjah. So what is interesting is that the Emirate of Sharjah has borders next to other spaces. So while we don't typically work in other emirates, we are on the border, so we can create programming that serves and supports people in other places as well. So we have a wide range of, or a wide area to cover in the work that we do. And I think it's very important to think when we think about decentralizing, it's not, there are many advantages of being in the center and the core of the city, of course, which is, access to transportation, access to different facilities, being close to hotels, to markets, all of those things. But when we are branching out, sometimes in remote locations, by moving our activity and by creating activity in these different spaces, we create these center points. So for example, we have been working in specific areas that have been quite underutilized. And by having a biennial in these spaces, by putting public art in these spaces, what's happened is that other people have come and also used these spaces. And they've become new centers and new hubs for art and artistic production and culture and dialogue, which is very important. So when we are moving out to other spaces, we are also thinking about the possibilities and how to transform these spaces to purpose the entire community, not just us as an organization or the artist, but by creating, with public works and public projects, creating spaces for people to have, for example, public parks or seating or, public sculptures. So the work that we do is really ingrained and embedded with the community, and we work very slowly over a long period of time. But our biggest supporters and advocates are the community around us. So all of the projects that we do or create in these spaces are always done very closely with the community, taking the community's needs in mind and looking at what is missing and how we can fill that gap. And rather than build, big fancy buildings and working, we work with wonderful architects, but other than creating new buildings, we do a lot of repurposing and restoration. So we restore heritage sites and use them as a space to show art. We restore and repurpose buildings from the 70s that had a lot of, you have to imagine also the UAE is a young country. While we do have a very rich and old history in terms of, archaeology and civilization, the country itself was not built a very long time ago. So buildings from the 70s are not that old, but also old to a specific generation, and part of the UAE's urban fabric and landscape. So there are often times where we will use buildings from the 70s and repurpose them to show art. One of those buildings is the iconic Flying Saucer in Sharjah, which is nominated for architecture awards now, and different venues. But it's important that we are repurposing these buildings in order to make sure that we give them a new life that they are used again to show art. Some of these buildings have been abandoned, but were very instrumental in the UAE's development at the time. And it also preserves these buildings and creates a different dialogue in different parts of Sharjah. Thank you.
Before jumping back online, I think maybe I could give Cité. Yeah, so before we jump back online to make sure that we include our other speakers, I would like to give word to Professor Paolo so that we could perhaps you might like to do it like that. I'm sorry. Italian.
All right, so as you mentioned, well, I don't study museums. I'm an archaeologist, so what I do is I carry out research on the territory, and so I find myself exactly there in that very different landscape and context, which is like a box of fragments of separate pieces, separate realities and things which are far away from tourists. But anyhow, there's a common thread, that is to say, places and time. These are the common threads. So why am I saying this? Because in any place, sometime in the past, something happened. And these events may be connected to a material, tangible reality or something intangible. And we could always say something about it. We could always tell those events. And, well, you know, the museum and researchers should collaborate more in order to put together all these fragments, all these pieces that are scattered all around. But in the past, they were part of a system based on relationships. And so any context is characterized by its own history. I think that relocating and also marginalization, these are topics that we should tackle, and we should stop thinking about history as a set of tangible objects that we can't see anymore. Actually, reality is a system made of things which are all connected, and things keep on changing. But very often we don't see a lot about the past. We only see something here and there, and it is up to us to suggest a new connection, rediscovering the past connections, so that these links, these connections emerge again and are displayed, are told. So the system of places, by doing that, will be the possibility to learn something. I don't know if I was clear enough. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Buongiorno.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. I would have loved to be in Rome. Unfortunately, I cannot be there, but it is a great pleasure to be part of this panel about relocalization. I would like to go back to the issue that has already been mentioned. we talk about decentralization, and the French politics had been investing in decentralization because France, unlike Italy, is really based on the central government, and so Jacques Lang tried to move from the center of Paris to rural areas. So starting from the 80s, they believed in the urban development on the outskirts of Paris. And so these solutions were created, for example, right before the re-centralization, for example, of Centre Pompidou. So basically we have structures with our art productions on some issues. For example, the Centre Pompidou in 2000 decided to decentralize, not really the main site, but there is, let's say, a twin structure. So Centre Pompidou Metz was created in 2010, and it is an independent structure. We are not, let's say, we are not dependent on the main museum. It is a separate museum supported by local authorities and the Grand East region. It is 1 hour from Paris, in the city of Metz and the metropolitan city. So they do support the museum since 10 years, and we are not, let's say, we are not reporting to the Ministry of Culture, but we are part of the family of the Centre Pompidou. So we are, of course, benefiting from the cultural policy, around the Centre Pompidou. So we can benefit from this, from the same values. We do not have a permanent collection. We have, let's say, traveling collections. So we use, let's say, many works. We can ask for works from the 20th and 21st century, but we believe the same values of Centre Pompidou. So we have many advantages because we are part of a big family, but at the same time we are independent also from a scientific point of view, and at the same time there are also, for example, not-for-profit making associations that support us in cities, and they support, let's say, museums in cities which are not the capital city, in the main city. And architects, well, big museums were designed by outstanding architects. We have Renzo Piano, for example, Chiara for Pompidou Metz, so big names. The idea is to create beautiful buildings through, big names in terms of architects. Thank you. This is my contribution.
But I can hear myself double. I would like to give the word next to Signor Umberto Croppi for his intervention.
I think our territory is unique in a way, because our museums are so different also because of geographical and historical reasons. So, talking about relocalization. Well, in Italy, this does not really make sense because, our heritage is scattered through our country. So everywhere in Italy, you have cultural signs. To give you some figures, museums recognized as such are more than 5,000. Only 10% belong to the central government, let's say. The remaining museums belong to local authorities. For example, the administration in Rome has more than 40 museums, but also regional administrations or museums. Then there are private museums, which are not so many. And then we have roughly 500 archives and business-owned museums. So businesses decided to create museums to show their heritage of their brands. Roughly 100 museums are open to public. And then there are thousands of small museums which are located in small villages. For example, museums about traditions and agriculture, let's say habits, in order to, let's say, maintain memory of the past. I mean, these are museums only, but there are also other activities, of course, from a culture point of view. And in terms of management as well, it is really fragmented. The situation is fragmented in Italy because there are different bodies and authorities in charge of them. In particular, we also have let's say central bodies, but also local ones. And sometimes there are conflicts between administrations and even within the same administrations. And also, from one city to the other, of course, there are some conflicts as well. In Italy, we are starting to integrate museums. The Ministry of Culture has launched a project, and this project is carried out by Federculture, so museums for the territorial development, and some regulations were also passed, and some pilot projects were conducted, although we have still some difficulties to overcome. Personally, 2 months ago, our association prepared the dossier for Siracusa as capital of culture in 2024. So local authorities have to think in terms of integration. So administrations have to communicate one to another and with the communities and their territory. So concerning the development of museums, if we consider museums, but also, let's say, traditions and our heritage, but also museums, and well, also in terms of definition of museum, sometimes we do not agree on a definition of museum because there are different types of museums, because we have so many types of museums in Italy. However, museums can really play an important role, provided that we go beyond the idea that museum means tourism, because the development of the territory can be promoted by museums, but this means development of potentials of the territory, social potential, and also life quality, and also the investments. I mean, tourism is just one component. It is not the most important one and not the only one we have.
But I wanted to say that I hope that we come back to this 3 or even 4 T's. What is it? Talent, tourism, technology, tolerance. Hopefully we'll come back to that. But last but not least, I'd like to give the word to Sophie Langioma, and I will pass on my headphones.
Thank you, Evgenia. So as you said, I work for a wine museum in Bordeaux. So it's a different model because we have no art collection and we work about interactive experience. So it's a thematic museum. It's another type, as you said. And I don't really want to talk about relocalization or relocating museum. We have a project to open a new museum in Beijing about wine. But it's not relocating, it's not a true relocation because we don't close the museum in Bordeaux to open one in Beijing. It's just a replication of a model. And the Cité du Vin is managed by the foundation. It's a private company. And it's more like an expansion strategy than relocation, really. It's hard to and so just a few more words. I think for us, for the thematic museum, what's the question that we have to ask ourselves is how far can the concept can be adapted, and even on the wine thematic. So maybe we can't implant all the museum in all countries. The concepts are not exportable in the same way in all the culture, and that's my question today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's in fact something that we are struggling at the moment in the V&A as well, is how do we work with our partners abroad and when it's a completely different context. I wanted, while we still have Chiara, do we have her online? I wanted to just kind of, thank you, Chiara, before you go, because I know you don't have as much time, I wanted to, before we come back to a particular Italian context, I'm really interested in what happens sort of when you open a branch of a bigger museum in a new territory. How the sort of what relationship that it creates with existing museums locally or regionally, and how that affects the relationship with the mothership. Because, for example, we at the moment are going through a huge crisis of identity because we are growing so fast. So what does that mean for the relationship between the branch and mothership? What does it mean for the mothership? Is the relationship perhaps a little bit more reciprocal rather than one way? Sort of, yeah, if you've got anything to say on that subject. Could we get to Chiara?
Ragazzi, Grazie Eugenia.
Thank you. Yes, Centre Pompidou was created 50 years ago, and the museum wanted to expand beyond the city centre. Metz is a beautiful city with a Gothical architecture. There is also a big Italian community, and Italians moved to this city for industrial reasons. So when Centre Pompidou decided to transfer the collection values and vision to this new site, well, first of all, it was a sort of a cross-domain thing, and when the decision was made to set up this branch, I mean, I was not there when this happened, but the Met was basically created in the building of a plant. So this, let's say, former plant was used and transformed into the museum. So we are connected to the Centre Pompidou, but we are independent. So the main advantage is that, as I said, we can, let's say, exploit this collection, which is the second most important collection in Europe. But at the same time, we are independent from a scientific point of view. We organize our activities and events fully independently. When you talked about communities, well, you know, the museum is born in Metz, so our teams, our personnel is there. I'm Italian. I moved to Paris, so there is a mix of, let's say, backgrounds, of nationalities and cultures, but we are rooted in this city. We live in the city, so there is a very good relationship with the city. We organize events and exhibitions, and we always try, for example, to also have some artifacts from a local museum or from other regions, but also from, let's say, other countries. So we do not want to be local only. We are local but national and international at the same time. And this is one of the key features of Centre Pompidou. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, we're just switching to Nawar. I want to...
Hi, thank you so much. I think something that's very important as well, kind of going off on what we were discussing, but also thinking about is looking at the idea of the mothership and branching out in terms of new spaces or museums, and something that we are doing. I mean, we are a main museum. However, we do not have smaller museums under our wing. We have branches, however, and the branches of the museum sometimes do not look like the main museum. They're different. We have art centers, for example, 7 art centers that fall under the Sharjah Art Foundation that are focused on craft, that are focused on skills, building skills, and are centered around families children, and very different from the international contemporary programming and experimental programming that we do. These smaller art centers have very different identities sometimes, and that's okay. I think there are sometimes questions of how to link smaller branches to the bigger museum or to the same identity of the museum. But we found that sometimes it's really great to have a little bit of independence, if that makes sense, from the main museum or the main space, and to have these smaller platforms or these smaller institutions that can serve a different purpose. So for example, with the Sharjah Art Foundation, we are known for working with major international artists from our region and beyond, which left us for a very long time without room for more classical training, for example. So now we have had 7 art centers that were under the government that were given to us, which means that our organization really grew overnight when we were handed these centers, that are based in small towns. So they're not in the center of the city, they're not in a main city, but they are in smaller parts of Sharjah in different locations, mostly residential areas in smaller towns. And what we were able to do with these small branches is introduce different focuses in different geographic locations. So one of our art centers focuses on pottery. We have something else that works with weaving, with crafts, and things that we were maybe not able to, or avenues that we were not able to explore through our main exhibition space. However, with these smaller art centers, this is how we focus. Everything is mostly conducted in the Arabic language. And the audience is very local. It's not an international audience. It's mostly an Arab-speaking audience. And with these different organizations, there is a link, of course, and they are under the Sharjah Art Foundation brand and the Sharjah Art Foundation institution. However, they are treated very differently. We speak about them differently, and I think it's sometimes an advantage because you do not have to be tied so much to this very defined institutional image. There is more room for experimentation there within these smaller scale projects. And that is the same with all of our projects when they are smaller and they're introduced. There's always experimentation. There's always trial and error. And it's really interesting to see how we can start with these smaller art centers or projects and turn them into something bigger in the future. So that's kind of how we are navigating these issues. Thank you.
Okay, I am broadcasting. Thank you. I'm really pleased that Sheikha Nawar spoke about experimentation, because this is something that I noticed in your intervention as well, Emanuela, that it's almost like your smaller scale or your greater proximity to your audience allows you to be a bit more free almost than if you were a massive brand of a massive museum, built by a star architect. Would you agree with that?
Sorry, we cannot hear. There is no sound, there is no audio. Right, okay. So, for example, if you have to talk to the mayor of a small city, talking with the mayor of the administration of a small city is easier than talking, let's say, to the administration of a big city like Milan. And also the decision-making process is much faster and smoother. I think we should lay the preconditions for working in these small realities. Personally, I think that when we talk about cultural heritage, we have to consider the context, the Italian context. Unfortunately, in Italy, our heritage is not studied at schools. So this means that young people do not know how important and varied our heritage is. So So Italians know the Uffizi Museum, but they do not know the smaller museums, for example, in the Lombardy region. And also, there is another point of interest. In the 2018 report, it was found out that people older than 25 years were considered as inactive from a cultural point of view, and the percentage of these people is 38%. So they basically do not do any cultural activity. And so, you know, we have to, of course, exploit the potential of our heritage. But first of all, we have to raise awareness among these people so that they can really enjoy the small museums. And having said this, you know, when you work in a small museum, or if you make some mistakes, I mean, nobody will know, okay?
And funding as well. I think that's hopefully we'll come back to that in a moment. But before we do that, I wanted to make sure that I touch, Sophie, on your institution. You talked about the opening of another museum really near yours that has created almost a sense of competition for you. And again, coming back to what you were saying, Umberto, about competition between even, you know, borghi next to each other and that sort of campanilismo. Would you comment on that very quickly?
Thank you. Okay, yes. The museum, which is called Le Bassin des Lumières, which is managed by Culture Espace in France, opens near the Cité du Vin. And it creates competition between the twin. Because, you know, when you open a museum, which is a destination, which has a strong brand, people come to see the museum. But if you have not so strong brand, it's just create competition. But it could be an advantage. So we need to check our mind and find new solutions and create a renewal strategy just to update our offer. So it's an advantage too. Yes, really. But it's not as a site of destination such as Le Louvre, Pompidou, and people come in the destination to see the museum and the new one.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, you touched on brand as well, and that, I think that keeps coming through more and more when we talk about museums and the importance of that, and whether the audience have come to expect that from a cultural organization, whether they are big or small. Let's go back to perhaps to funding. Actually, I wanted to talk about that a little bit, and particularly in the case of the COVID pandemic, because that I'm sure that affected museums around the world. But particularly for the case of Italy, I wonder whether any of you perhaps would like to comment. Well, on two things really. What I wanted to is how that changed your engagement strategy with your audiences, whether that brought you closer to your audiences, or this forced closure, especially in the case when it's a museum that people don't know about very much anyway, perhaps not even locally, whether that's created that sort of rupture or not, how that's changed, and also what changes to the funding landscape that has created, because I think you all have very different. You deal with very different funding streams. You know, a combination of public and private, nationally funded. How has that changed? And you know, what's the hope for the future?
Well, what we heard earlier was, well, I'm an archaeologist. I don't work for museums. I'm an archaeologist. And, this is quite a big difference indeed. Our universities train museum experts. Recently, we're also offering training to economists of culture. But in most of the cases, museums keep on working based on a very ancient system or matrix. If we just have a look at the professionals museums are looking for, art historians, architects, they don't look for managers. They never look for such professionals. So there are very few institutions in Italy that have this marketing, cultural marketing vision. They don't have a vision related to fundraising, for example. And I'd like to give you a few examples of that. Something else that we often hear also during public speaking or official speaking, we hear that Louvre by itself, the bookshop of the Louvre has higher revenues than all the revenues of Italian museums. We know, but Louvre Museum has almost 105 million euros from the French government, which is probably much more than all the money that is given to all Italian museums. And there's also an office for fundraising with 18 employees. In Italy, we don't have a museum with a fundraising office, apart from the Egyptian Museum in Turin, that is something separate or an isolated case, So the question on how our system has faced this crisis and how we're going to restart. This is still a pending question. We don't have an answer yet. We have to acknowledge, indeed, that the Italian government has given money, emergency funding that has allowed our very complex museum system to keep on their feet. Of course, we had to dismiss some people, to make some people redundant, and we had some economic problems. And also, we had to digitalize our services and system. Our mindset has changed, for sure. But, technologies are now offering us new possibilities. And then there's also the other topic related to skills. Archaeologists are really good at digging and also finding archaeologist objects and findings. But then you need the storyteller. So at the moment, we are lacking this type of culture. Apart from the technological tools that we're using, which are certainly needed, but then you need to be able how to tell these stories. So you also need to convey messages to those people, for example, those that 40% of the Italian population that never goes to museums. So you need to be able to translate this experience also for them. I'm sorry, I know that I speak for too long.
Super quickly, since we started talking about commercialization, fundraising, financial self-sustainability. We have a commercial director right here. Could you say something a little bit about your organization and what is the role of a department like yours within the organization? How involved you are, how much influence you have, how you work with the rest of, with the curatorial education team, all of that?
Yes, I could, of course. Just to let you know, the success of the Cité du Vin resides in a balanced economic model. We can finance everything without public subsidy, except for investment, except for the big part when we turn around and make the big change in the permanent tour. But to live every day, to pay our colleagues and everything, we don't need public subsidy. So yes, commercial is really important in our economic model, and we have different type of revenue. We have all the events organized for the company, corporate privatization. We have the shop, and it's my new job, so I can speak about it, but gift shops, it's really important to us. We have restoration. We have, of course, ticketing system. And with all these components, we can build a balanced economic model. And for us, in fact, the commercial, it's really in the heart of the company. And after all, we have another part which is really important to us. It's the patronage. To build the Cité du Vin, we have 83 private companies who became patrons, and they give money for the construction, and it financed 19% of the construction of the building. The Cité du Vin is the first cultural facility in France to reach such a level of patronage. And we still have patrons for every exhibition that we made.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. That's really interesting to hear. Obviously, where I come from, it's a very similar situation to Italy in the sense that, well, actually, no, I take that back. Even the state museums receive only about 40% of their funding from the government, and the rest is self-generated. So when COVID hit, we lost more than 60% of our revenue and became completely exposed to this financial challenge. And that's forced us to really become very agile in the way we work and in the way we generate funding. But a lot of it is dependent on strong brand and strong talent. So talent is what I wanted to come back to. And since we have a professor who is there in the formation of next museum professionals, I wonder if you could, I just didn't want to leave you out there. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on sort of what you see in the young upcoming talent that you're working with.
Talento oggettivo, secondo me, e la strategia formativa.
Well, it depends on our objectives, of course, on the objectives that we have at the moment. So apart from, ancient Romans used to say a shoemaker should only think about shoes. So this means that we can't do everything. We can't have the skills in order to do everything. What kind of talent do we need? We need to be skilled, but what for? So, of course, we're now trying to train the professionals of the future, but obviously it all depends on our objectives. A good way to face a crisis, either a health crisis or lack of money, is that we need to find the best quality ever, because we don't have many possibilities. We have only few possibilities. This is why we need to support only the right skills. So again, the topic of sharing culture, going out of, well, thinking only, just about money. I think we have to understand what our objectives are, and probably we have just sit on our laurels until now, and we have always thought that highly prepared elite like well, British people or foreigners would come to Italy. They already knew about ancient history. They would go to Pompeii to see the house because they knew it all already. They would go to Paestum to see the temple because they knew it all. So only the elite would come to Italy, but this is not the current situation anymore. This elite doesn't exist anymore. Italy keeps on being an attraction for many people, but there's no more elite anymore. Tourism is a global tourism now, but it's even worse than that. I mean, there are many Italian people that don't have the right culture to understand culture. So we need to prepare to train cultural mediators. And well, this is what we have to do. We have to train our younger generations on the fact that they don't just have to describe a work of art. It's not just about describing. Of course, in Louvre, in Metropolitan Museum, there are beautiful works of art. But now it's time to learn how to put together these fragments, translate them in order to explain what kind of reality they represented, in order to facilitate other people's learning. This is what we have to do now. We have to educate our younger generations in order to be very skilled professionals who are able to integrate, to recreate those systems that we can find inside museums. As Mr. Croppi said.
Organizations like yours, how does that, from your point of view?
Che invece sono necessarie.
We know we were totally unprepared to the lockdown. There was no professional who was ready to do what was requested to us at that time. So I agree. The topic of mediation is fundamental. Skills and ability to tell, but you can only acquire this knowledge and these skills by doing things. We need to have real working occasions in order to test this. You can't learn how to do it at the university. You can only learn it if you do it in practice. I'd like to conclude by just add something to what the professor said. The director of one of my archaeological museums showed me some text, and I told him where it had to be written. And he said, all right, so you want people to understand, really?
I wanted to finish there, but I don't want to leave them completely out. Chiara is gone. Okay, is Sheikha Nawar still there? She's still there? Okay. Just as a final point, before we move on to her, just as a final point, although this was a brilliant and, but I just wanted to ask all of you, literally, in a few phrases, for the future, for future leaders of big museum branches, small regional, national, state museums, new museums that are opening and are going to be opening in the next few years. What's your advice? Let's move to Sheikha Nawar, if she could respond very quickly to this.
Thank you so much for the question, for the engaging conversation and dialogue. Big question for the future. I think something that we've noticed and something that we've learned working through the pandemic and working through difficult times and working in situations where we rely on both public and private funding. When we emerged from the pandemic or when we emerged from our lockdowns, we noticed that our visitor numbers had skyrocketed. We've had visitors like we've never had before. Thankfully, the UAE was not as badly affected as in other places, and it was not so bad here. But we noticed that people had a hunger and a thirst for art and culture like they didn't have before. And we had to adapt. We had to be flexible, and we had to think very quickly and act very quickly. We had to embrace new technologies and start programming online. We had to think about spacing. And when we are doing exhibitions, a lot of times we want to create small and intimate spaces, and you can't have that anymore, or we couldn't, at least for the year that we had been operating in. And I think we thought about a lot of things that we didn't in the past. My advice would be for new museums that are opening, or for people who are continuing to work and continuing to program, is to always have the opportunity to be flexible and to always make sure that you have the opportunity to adapt quickly and to be very close to audiences and the needs of people. I think a lot of times institutions are run with a set focus or framework in mind, and it's so important to be able to adapt. It's so important to be able to change when needed, and it's okay to experiment. It's okay to postpone and push things. I mean, we've postponed our biennial now for 2 years, and I think it was one of the best decisions that we made, because it means that artists have more time to create work, to travel, to do research where they couldn't have in the past. So I think flexibility is very important. I think experimentation is very important, and I think it's important to let go of a lot of preconceived notions and thinking of things and saying, well, we can't do this as an institution, or this doesn't fit our brand, or that's not how we usually operate, and to be very creative and to be able to work in the times that we are today. I think we all have to just think very differently. And really trust in the process and work and make sure that we're giving ourselves time to work and to think ahead. And I think embracing technology is also something that's very, very important. We've seen so much online. We've seen so many things adapt and change to digital and virtual formats. So I think one of the most important things would be to be open to experimentation and open to trying new things. Thank you so much.
To finish with opening it to the floor, does anyone in the audience have any questions for any one of our panelists? Yes, please. Sorry, everybody has to come and do this. This is a very performative lecture. Così la sentono online.
Sorry about the translation. Translator apologizes, but we can't hear. There's no audio. There's no audio. So we're now starting to see museums that are a bit like companies. But I see that state museums in Italy still have some problems. That is to say, they don't give enough importance to these new professionals differently from large international museums. So what do you suggest to Italian students? Those students that are interested in mediation, in explaining these concepts to the audience, people that are not part of the elite of the Grand Tour. What are your suggestions for students? It's not easy to reply to this question, of course. I would like to specify something. When you talk about the economy of culture and the management of culture, this refers to the economic management of institutions, always depending on the context. And then there's also another topic related to the budget. Actually, in Italy, we never know exactly how many tickets are sold. There are no indicators. There are no indicators related to the the economy connected to museums. So what I mean is, in Italy, we don't have the instruments in order to assess the economy generated by museums. But of course, we need to know the objectives. If the objective is to have a community involved, engaged, we have to take that into account. A library doesn't generate money, but it has a very important social value. So it always depends on the objective again. It doesn't depend on the quantity of tickets that you sell. So my suggestion for you is, and again, I repeat it, in all universities, not only the main universities, but there are some courses, master courses, dedicated on how to create mass. So if you create mass, you also impose the presence of these professionals. And then, there are now some new types of contracts also for professionals, and working for the public administration is not easy. But anyhow, now things are changing a little bit in Italy, and there are some new contracts for these new professionals. But again, we have to convince decision makers to take these new needs into consideration. Nothing else to say. Well, from the bottom, we have to push decision makers. Let's remember that in Italy, there's a law for professionals of the cultural heritage. So there's a new law which was passed only a few years ago after many students decided to become specialists in the cultural heritage. So you see, this is something that comes really from the bottom. And all these graduates convinced decision makers to pass the new law. So I remember that there was an interview to people going out of museums, and the people actually were replying that they had seen some paintings which were actually not in the museum at all. So my suggestion is just follow your heart, follow your nature. You are the only ones who know what you're passionate about. And also, second suggestion, remember that there may be some minor universities, not necessarily Bocconi or Sapienza University. There may be some minor universities that are really good too. And also, another suggestion, you know, people are entitled to have access to the cultural heritage. It's a human right. Remember that these skills might be developed also in private museums. So don't just think about state-run museums, state museums, but also remember that private museums exist. But it always depends on your choice. It's up to you.
I'm not Italian, but I think just a word could be reinvention. You're the new generation. You know what you like and what you want to see in the museum. Think about it. Just think maybe about a global experience. Maybe tomorrow we can touch, we can taste, we can act in the museum. And maybe we can see the things differently.
And any more questions? Anybody else? Please.
Good morning. I also have a question. Going back to what you said, based on my personal experience, I attended one of these master courses for the management of the cultural heritage, and I'm really satisfied. I'm really happy with it. And I also attended a master course abroad at l'École du Louvre, where, you know, you are really trained. So let's say that museum professionals are trained. There's one course for cultural mediators, and also you also get some competence and knowledge about the preservation of objects of art. But I see that, unfortunately, there's a gap between the Italian university training, and I graduated at La Sapienza, by the way, and the market and the work market offered by museums. So since nowadays exhibitions, art exhibitions are growing quite a lot, and this is based on the concept of branding of museums, as we said. So why not training professionals who are able to manage works of art? Well, I never heard about any condition report, facility report. I never heard about all these documents which are very important for professionals that are in charge of moving works of art. So I think that we would need to allow students to get closer to their future job, to the marketplace, even if, as you said, well, we know that in order to find a job in Italy, you are required to have previous work experience, but we don't have previous work experience. You know, we have the possibility to do some practice, but then at the end of the apprenticeship, they don't employ you. There's no contract for you. So again, I would also like to ask you, what do you think about our future? And there's something else. You know, based on the law of 2001, well, there would be some new jobs. So the registrar would be acknowledged as a professional, and but we're still lagging behind. Actually, there's been no changes since 2001. Like the cultural mediator, for example, in Italy is not recognized. We're still lagging behind. This is what I just wanted to say. This is my experience. And, well, I lived it in the first place. So even if we know what we want to do in the future, how can we have access to this world? How can we have access to museums if this is what our heart wants to do? Thank you. Well, I'd just like to tell you that I worked for 6 years at the University of Sciences and Communication at La Sapienza, and I was holding a course, giving a course on how to plan exhibitions, and so there are courses like the ones you requested. If you look for information, you will find some information. You will find some courses in the public universities. Of course, there are also some private universities. Well, you know, this is also another very difficult question. And, well, as you said earlier, you need to be informed. I'm trying to say very simple things. You can choose a traditional education, and then you can become a professional. It will take time to do that, or otherwise you could choose some traditional university studies. Then together with that, you will also do some practice. And then you will try and have access to public museums. But what really matters is that we need to have dialogue between professors and students in universities. In theory, we should decide together what we want to teach and learn in theory. I know that it's a very poor, very obvious reply, but well, you know, we need to find your vision about the future. We need to choose our perspective, and together, professors and students. Just one more thing. We have worked on the Charter of Museum Professions, or professionals. And, you know, our universities train these professionals. But the problem is in Italy, you know, the shifting from the charter to the reality of museums.